The sun hung low over the O'Connell ranch, casting long shadows across the cracked earth of the Wyoming prairie. Eliza O'Connell stood on the sagging porch of the family's weathered homestead, her hands clenched at her sides, staring at the leather-bound trunk that sat like a sentencing judge in the yard. It was a sturdy thing, its brass fittings glinting dully in the morning light, packed to the brim with the necessities her mother and father had deemed essential for a life she hadn't chosen. Inside were her best dresses, carefully folded linens, a worn Bible with her name scrawled in her mother's looping hand, and a single photograph of the family: her parents, her younger brother, and herself, frozen in a moment of forced smiles. The trunk was more than luggage. It was a symbol of the future her parents had bartered for her, a future tied to a man named Thomas Hargrove, a stranger from 2 towns over whose face she couldn't conjure, no matter how hard she tried. Her father's words from the night before still rang in her ears: "It's a good match, Eliza. Hargrove's got land, a steady income. You'll be secure." Secure. The word tasted like ash on her tongue, bitter and dry, as if security could replace the dreams she'd tucked away in the quiet corners of her heart. Eliza's boots scuffed the warped boards of the porch as she shifted her weight, her eyes fixed on the trunk. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and sagebrush, and a faint breeze tugged at the hem of her faded calico dress, the one she'd worn for 3 summers because there was no money for new fabric. At 22, she was no stranger to the harsh realities of ranch life: the endless chores, the lean winters, the way hope could wither like crops in a drought. But this was different. This was her life, her future, packed away by hands that weren't her own, for a man who'd sent a letter and a promise of stability. Her parents had called it the blessing, a way to ensure she wouldn't end up like her aunt, widowed and scrapping by in a shack on the edge of town. But to Eliza, it felt like a cage, its bars forged from duty and expectation. Her mother had wept while packing the trunk, her thin fingers trembling as she folded Eliza's Sunday dress, whispering about the importance of a woman's role, of sacrifice for the family's honor. Her father, stern and silent, had overseen the process with the same grim determination he used when branding cattle. They'd spoken of Hargrove's virtuosa, his 40 acres, his modest mercantile business, his reputation as a God-fearing man. But they hadn't asked Eliza what she wanted, not once. She tried to speak, to protest, but her words had been met with her father's raised hand and her mother's tearful plea to trust their judgment. "You're not a child anymore," her father had said. "This is the way of things." The way of things. The phrase had lodged in her chest like a splinter, festering with every passing hour. Now, standing on the porch, Eliza felt the weight of that splinter pressing against her ribs. The stagecoach was due at noon, less than an hour away, its arrival heralded by the distant rumble of wheels and the sharp blast of a horn. It would carry her to Laramie, to Hargrove, to a life she couldn't imagine. She tried to picture him, maybe a kind man, maybe not, but all she could summon was a vague shadow, faceless and cold. Her fingers traced the brass lock on the trunk, its surface cool despite the growing heat of the day. She wondered what Hargrove would think of her, with her calloused hands and sun-freckled cheeks, her stubborn streak that her mother swore would be her ruin. Would he expect a docile wife, eager to please? Would he care that she loved the way the wind sang through the cottonwoods, or that she'd once dreamed of seeing the ocean, its waves crashing against a shore she'd only read about in books? The sound of hoofbeats snapped her from her thoughts. She squinted against the glare of the sun, shielding her eyes with one hand as a lone rider emerged from the haze of dust on the horizon. His horse moved with a steady gait, kicking up clouds of red earth that shimmered in the light. He wasn't Hargrove, she knew that much instinctively. Hargrove was older, or so her father had said, a man in his late 30s, settled and practical. This rider was younger, his frame lean and wiry, his movements fluid as he guided his horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat tilted low, obscuring his face, but there was something about the way he carried himself, a confident, unhurried that made Eliza's pulse quicken. The rider slowed as he approached the ranch, his horse snorting softly as it came to a stop a few yards from the porch. He dismounted with a grace that seemed almost effortless, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Up close, Eliza could see the details her squinting hadn't caught, the faint scar curving along his temple, the stubble dusting his jaw, the storm cloud gray of his eyes. He was a cowboy, through and through, his clothes worn but clean, his hands calloused from work. He tipped his hat, revealing a mop of dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and fixed her with a look that was both curious and steady. "Miss Eliza O'Connell." His voice was low, like the rumble of a distant storm, steady and calm but with an undercurrent of strength. She nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Who are you?" "Name's Caleb Ward." He stepped closer, his hat still in one hand, the other resting lightly on the reins of his horse. "I heard you're headed to meet Hargrove." Eliza's stomach twisted, a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Word travels fast," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. News spread like wildfire in a town as small as theirs, but she hadn't expected a stranger to know her business before she'd even left the ranch. "Small towns," Caleb said with a shrug, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He glanced at the trunk, then back at her, his eyes searching her face. "Heard your folks arranged it." "That true?" She crossed her arms, her defenses rising like a wall. "What's it to you?" Caleb didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he leaned against the porch rail, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "Hargrove's not a bad man, from what I hear. Got a good spread, a store that turns a profit. But he's not the kind to ask what you want, is he? I reckon a woman like you's got a say in her own life." Eliza's breath caught, her heart stumbling over itself. No one had asked her what she wanted, and not her parents, not the preacher who'd blessed the arrangement, not even her best friend, Mary, who'd only sighed and said it was the way of things. Caleb's words were like a key turning in a lock, releasing something she'd kept buried deep. She studied him, searching for a trap, a hidden motive. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost a challenge. He shifted, his boots scuffing the dirt as he looked out at the horizon, then back at her. "Saw you at the harvest dance last fall," he said. "You were dancing with that kid, Tommy Grayson, laughing like you meant it, not like you were trying to please anyone. Figured a woman with a laugh like that ought to have a choice in who she spends her life with." His eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "I ain't got much as some cattle, a patch of land I'm working to make something of. But I'd wager I could earn your yes, if you let me try." The words hung in the air, bold and reckless, like a spark in a dry field. Eliza's heart pounded, her mind racing. She remembered the harvest dance, the way the fiddles had filled the barn with music, the way she'd laughed with Tommy, who was barely 18 and more boy than man. She hadn't known anyone was watching, least of all this cowboy with his quiet intensity. His offer wasn't a promise of wealth or security, not like Hargrove's, but it was something else, something wilder, truer. A chance to choose. The distant blare of the stagecoach horn cut through the silence, sharp and insistent. Eliza's gaze darted to the road, where a faint cloud of dust signaled its approach. Her time was running out. She looked back at Caleb, his hat still in his hands, his eyes steady on hers. She thought of Hargrove, of the life her parents had planned, of the trunk packed with someone else's dreams. Then she thought of the ocean, of the wind in the cottonwoods, of the way Caleb's voice had carried a quiet promise of something more. "Wait here," she said, her voice steady for the first time all morning. She turned and marched inside, past her mother's startled gasp, past her father's furrowed brow. The trunk sat open in the parlor, its contents neatly arranged. She reached in and pulled out the photograph of her family, her fingers brushing the worn edges. She'd write to Hargrove, explain herself as best she could. But she wouldn't board that stagecoach. When she stepped back onto the porch, Caleb was still there, his horse grazing lazily behind him. He straightened as she approached, his expression unreadable but his eyes bright with something like hope. "Tell me about this land of yours," she said, clutching the photograph to her chest. A slow grin spread across his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. "It's got a creek that sings at night," he said, "and enough sky to make you forget your troubles. But it's better if I show you." Eliza nodded, the weight of the trunk behind her fading like a bad dream. For the first time, the future felt like hers to shape, and she stepped toward it, one uncertain but determined step at a time.